In the book of Romans, having set out the gospel, Paul comes to a climax and he says, "Now may the God of peace fill you with all joy and peace in believing." Now there's the right sequence. We believe, then he gives the peace, then he gives the joy. But it's the believing that brings about the Christian fruit: love, joy, peace. And that's the real sign. In the States, where Christianity is much more public, much more widespread than any other country of the world, on television and on radio, the emphasis in most places is more on the gifts than the fruit. That's not biblical. Don't despise the gifts. They are for real, but they're much less rare than popular religion would have you think. But the real test is, do you have the love, the joy, the peace, the long-suffering, the gentleness, the goodness, the faith, self-control? Can't be counterfeited. So those two verses are very important. Look again, please, at the chapter. There's a very striking verse here that speaks about a carcass. Now, that's not a very nice idea, but it comes from our Lord's lips, and we should look at it. Verse 28, "Wherever there's a carcass, there will the vultures gather." What's that mean? It means when human society has become like a putrefying dead thing, when society is beyond all life and help, when society can no longer be resurrected and charged with new life, when it's so far gone, it's foul, it stinks, then Jesus says judgment will fall. We're getting close to that now. You know, it is quite sickening to read any summary of today's news. It is quite sickening. And when we read what young people are going, because young people today are lost, and the main cause of death in young people today, next to road accidents, is suicide, because they don't know who they are. And if you don't know who you are, you'll either fall into overwork or drugs or suicide, ultimately. See? So we have a very strange world where the Ten Commandments are despised and ignored, violence, impurity run amok. And Jesus says when this is altogether worldwide and the world is beyond help, then the judgment. Where the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. This happened to Jerusalem. After they crucified Christ, persecuted the apostles and the early Christians, the Romans came and destroyed the carcass. The temple was burnt. The remaining Jews either went into captivity or were scattered as slaves. This happened to the Roman Empire. The great Roman Empire, in the early centuries, there was no such thing as divorce. But in the later centuries, there wasn't much bothering about marriage. Men took them wives of all of which they chose and abused them. So when the Roman Empire became a carcass, the Lord let the barbarians come down, destroyed it. It happened in France. In France, there was terrible injustice, a lot of it coming from the church. But the French Revolution was like a judgment that changed all that. And so one day soon, the carcass of this world, the Lord will deal with it by Judgment Day. To make sure you follow where we've been, I want you to look at chapter 26. And would you kindly notice verse 40 onwards? This is in Gethsemane. "He returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. 'Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour?' he asked Peter. 'Watch and pray so you may not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.'" Come down, please, towards the end of this section, verse 43. "He returned to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near. Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So here are the key words of the Olivet Sermon being fulfilled in our Lord Jesus Christ. And one day they'll be fulfilled in the Christian church all around the world. In Matthew 24, our Lord says, as a sign of the last days, the love of the many will grow cold. Now please notice what he's saying. Will go cold means it's once been warm. So when Christ talks about a lack of love, he's not talking about the unbeliever. He's talking about professed believers, and he's saying that in most of the world, in most of the Christian gatherings, most will lose their faith. That's scary. The love of the many will grow cold. So you and I have to have something better than a mere head knowledge. It's not enough to know the theory. We mustn't just talk the talk. We've got to walk the walk. It's not enough to know the theory. The time is coming when most professed Christians will throw in the sponge. That's scary, but that's what it says. The love of the many will wax cold. Now come please to chapter 25, and notice in this last part of the sermon he gives some stories. Just before we look at 25, there is a story at the end of 24, beginning at verse 49. We'll read that first. Chapter 24, verse 49. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It'll be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. I tell you the truth, he'll put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master's staying away a long time. And he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunken. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him. At an hour he is not aware of, he'll cut him in pieces, assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's pretty terrible stuff. Here's the Lord of love talking about cutting in pieces human being, consigning him to the darkness, where he goes insane, so there's gnashing of teeth, one of the signs of some forms of insanity. That's scary stuff. Our Lord is foreseeing what would happen after his death, that the Christian church would become subject to leaders who were not converted men, who would act as lords over Christ's heritage. And this went on for centuries. Many historians have suggested as up to 50 million Christians were murdered by the church as it enlisted the state, the Inquisition and so on. I doubt the number in reality was that big, but it was pretty awful. And Christ is foretelling it. He's saying, beware. If you think because I don't come back immediately I'm not coming, and you fall into sin, you will be cut in pieces and you'll go insane when you're thrown into outer darkness. Christ warns about terrible things so that they may not happen. He wants us to be so scared that it won't happen to us. But here's a forecast of what Christianity had, because it is a tragedy that the Christian church became baptized paganism by the 4th century of the Christian era. And because the pagans worshipped women, the Christian church began to worship Mary. And because the pagans had all sorts of saints, now the Christian church made saints out of Peter and all the rest of them. Baptized paganism walked into Christianity, and with it an iron hand and no velvet glove.